The unbearable heat made the city swelter, as a barefoot child walked between the cars with a bag of candy. Ignored by many and humiliated for asking for just a cup of water, she almost collapsed from thirst. It was then that an unexpected gesture from a stranger changed everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. And now, on with the story. The July sun beat down mercilessly on Fifth Avenue that summer afternoon. The asphalt seemed to melt under the feet of hurried pedestrians, and the heat rose in visible waves, distorting the landscape of skyscrapers and gridlocked cars. It was almost 3 in the afternoon, a time when New York City seemed to boil along with the tempers of drivers trapped in the endless traffic. Amid the insistent honking and the exhaust fumes, small, fragile figure walked barefoot between the stopped cars. Isabella was only 5, but her large dark eyes carried a weariness that didn't belong in childhood. Her faded pink dress clung to her sweaty little body, and her bare feet stepped carefully on the hot asphalt, hopping from shadow to shadow whenever possible. In her small hands, a crumpled plastic baggie held a few peppermints, her only possession at that moment. With a thin, timid voice, she approached the car windows, repeating the same phrase she had memorized. "Want to buy a mint, mister? It's to help my mommy." Most drivers didn't even look at her. Some rolled up their windows quickly, as if the presence of this child was a threat to the air conditioning of their imported cars. Others stared at her with a mixture of pity and irritation, but never enough to open their wallets. Isabella didn't quite understand why people seemed afraid of her, or why they turned their faces away when she got close. She only knew that her mommy was at home, lying on the old living room couch, too weak to get up. That morning when she woke up, Isabella had found the fridge empty, except for a half-full bottle of water. Her mother, Camilla, had tried to smile at her, stroking her own feverish, sweaty face, and whispered that everything would be okay, that it was just a passing bug. But Isabella saw the way her mother trembled when she tried to stand, how she held her head in her hands, how her eyes were different, dull. It was then that the little girl, with a courage she didn't know she had, took the baggie of mints her mother kept for emergencies and decided she was going to help. After all, her mommy always said they were a team, and on a team you help each other. The heat intensified with every minute. Isabella felt her throat getting drier, her tongue heavy in her mouth. She'd only sold 2 mints in almost 2 hours of walking between the cars. The money was barely enough to buy a loaf of bread. The dizziness started slowly, a strange feeling in her head that made everything spin a little. She blinked several times, trying to focus, but the world seemed to shimmer along with the heat rising from the pavement. That's when her tired eyes found the perfect refuge across the street. An elegant wine boutique with a mirrored glass facade and a varnished wooden door. Through the glass, she could see the air-conditioned interior, the organized shelves of expensive bottles, well-dressed people circulating with brown paper bags. But what really caught her attention was the water cooler she saw near the counter. Without a second thought, Isabella waited for the light to turn red and ran across, clutching the baggie of mints to her chest. As she pushed open the glass door, a wave of cold air enveloped her, so strong it made her shiver. The contrast with the heat outside was almost painful. Her little eyes scanned the spacious room, the gleaming porcelain tile floor, the soft lights, the smell of wood and wine she couldn't identify. Behind the polished granite counter, a man in his 30s with gelled hair and an impeccable dress shirt was arranging crystal glasses. Mark was known among the staff for his arrogance toward customers he deemed unworthy of the establishment. When he saw the barefoot, sweaty girl who had clearly come from the street, his face twisted into an expression of disgust. Isabella approached the counter with small, hesitant steps. She could barely reach the top of the marble, so she stood on her tiptoes and said, her voice cracking with thirst, "Mister, can you please give me a cup of water? I'm really thirsty." The silence that followed was heavy. Mark stopped what he was doing and looked down at the girl as if she were an unwanted stain in his perfect environment. Without any kindness, he replied loudly, making sure all the customers present could hear. "This is no place for a street kid. You're dirtying my floor, scaring away the customers. Get out of here now before I call security." Isabella felt her face burn, but not from the heat. It was shame, a terrible feeling that squeezed her small chest. A few people looked at the scene uncomfortably, but no one said a word. The girl brought a hand to her forehead, feeling the dizziness intensify. The world began to spin faster. Her little legs trembled, and she had to lean on the counter to keep from falling. It was at that moment that a deep, firm, and authoritative voice cut through the room. "Stop that right now." Everyone turned toward the voice. In the back of the boutique, at a private table surrounded by collector's edition wine bottles, a man was rising to his feet. Edward Miller was a well-preserved 50, with impeccably styled graying hair, a tailor-made navy blue suit, and a presence that commanded any room he entered. A real estate mogul and owner of one of New York's largest construction firms, Edward was the kind of client Mark shamelessly fawned over. But at that moment, Edward's expression was not that of a satisfied customer. It was of someone deeply disturbed by what he had just witnessed. He walked to the counter with decisive steps, his eyes fixed on the employee. "Since when does this shop refuse a child a glass of water?" His voice was low, but it carried an authority that made the walls tremble more than any shout could. Mark swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. "Mr. Miller, you don't understand. She's a street kid. She begs for money, bothers the customers, and you," Edward interrupted, "are paid to serve, not to judge. Bring a glass of cold water, some fresh juice, and something for this girl to eat, immediately. And be quick about it." The employee, red with embarrassment and suppressed anger, had no choice but to obey. Edward then knelt, bringing himself to Isabella's level. For the first time in hours, someone was truly looking into her eyes, with attention, with care. "Hi, little one. What's your name?" he asked, his voice much softer now. "Isabella," she answered quietly, still trembling. "Isabella, what a beautiful name. Come, sit with me." He guided her to his table, pulling out a chair and helping the little girl climb up. When Mark brought the glass of water, Edward took it and offered it to Isabella himself. She drank in desperate gulps, the cold water soothing her dry throat. "Slowly, little one, slowly," Edward said gently, holding the cup so she wouldn't choke. He observed her sunburnt face, her simple but clean clothes, her bruised bare feet. It wasn't the first time he'd seen children on the streets of New York, but it was the first time he had truly stopped to see one of them. After drinking the water and eating a few bites of a cheese sandwich that Edward had ordered, Isabella started to feel a little better. It was then that he asked carefully, "Isabella, why are you out selling mints alone in this heat? Where's your mother?" The little girl's eyes filled with tears. "Mommy's at home. She's sick, lying on the couch. She said it was just a bug, but I saw she was shaking and couldn't get up. There was no more food at home, so I took the mints and came to help." Edward felt something tighten in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He, who lived surrounded by luxury, multi-million-dollar deals, and dinners at expensive restaurants, was faced with a problem so simple and so devastating. A sick mother, a 5-year-old daughter alone on the street trying to survive by selling mints under a 100-degree sun. "Where do you live, Isabella?" he asked, already pulling his phone from his pocket. "In Astoria, Queens, in a little house at the end of the street," she replied, describing the address with the precision her mother had taught her in case she ever got lost. Edward immediately called his driver and his trusted security guard, who always accompanied him in delicate situations. "Robert, I need you to go to this address urgently," he dictated the location, "and check on a woman who is unwell. If it's serious, take her to the hospital immediately. This is urgent." While he waited, Edward talked more with Isabella. He learned that she and her mother lived alone, that her mother worked as a housekeeper, cleaning houses and offices, and that her father had left when she was a baby. The girl told him everything with a moving sincerity, unaware of the weight of the information. 20 minutes later, Edward's phone rang. It was Robert, and the news wasn't good. "Mr. Miller, we found the girl's mother. She's passed out on the couch, very pale in a cold sweat. We've called an ambulance, but you know how long that can take in this traffic." "Don't wait for the ambulance," Edward ordered, his voice stern. "Put her in the car and take her to Mount Sinai Hospital immediately. I'll meet you there. And Robert, treat her as if she were my own family, understood?" "Understood, sir." Edward looked at Isabella, who was staring at him with wide eyes, not fully understanding what was happening. He knelt again, holding the girl's small hands. "Isabella, your mum needs help from doctors. My friends are taking her to a very good hospital, and we're going to meet her there. Do you trust me?" The girl looked deep into the eyes of the man who, just minutes ago, was a stranger, but there was something in his gaze, a firmness, a security she hadn't felt in a long time. She nodded. "Then let's go." Edward held out his hand, and Isabella grasped it tightly. As they left the wine boutique, Edward stopped in front of Mark, who was watching everything with a mixture of astonishment and fear. The employee who minutes earlier had felt superior for serving wealthy clients was now pale and sweating, realizing he had made a terrible mistake. Edward approached him, and his voice, though low, carried the weight of decades of authority. "You," Edward said, pointing at the employee, his eyes fixed and piercing, "are going to learn an important lesson today. A person's dignity isn't measured by the money in their pocket or the clothes they wear. This little girl who you treated like trash has more courage and humanity in her little finger than you will have in your entire life. She was here asking for water, not a handout, not favors, just water. And you, instead of seeing a thirsty child, saw an inconvenience for your important customers." Edward paused, letting the words sink in, then continued with even more firmness. "And if I ever find out you've treated anyone else like this, especially a child, I will personally make sure you never work in any decent establishment in this city again. I will speak to every owner of every wine shop, restaurant, and store I know. And believe me, I know a lot of them. Is that clear?" Mark could only nod, pale, his shirt now stained with sweat. A few customers who had witnessed the scene applauded discreetly as Edward and Isabella left. An elegant woman, who had watched everything from her table, stood up and said to the boutique's manager, who had just rushed over after hearing the commotion, "That employee is a disgrace to this establishment. I will never come back here if he continues to work here." Other voices joined hers, and the manager realized he would have to make a quick decision. Outside, the afternoon was still scorching, but Edward barely felt the heat. His mind was focused on getting to the hospital, on ensuring that this woman, the mother of this brave little girl, received the best possible care. He placed Isabella in the back seat of his luxury car, cranked up the air conditioning, and headed toward Mount Sinai Hospital. During the drive, Edward glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Isabella clutching the baggie of mints to her chest, her eyes fixed on the window, clearly worried. The girl's silence was eloquent, filled with a fear she didn't know how to express. Edward tried to make small talk a few times, asking about simple things like her favorite color or her favorite toy, but Isabella only answered in monosyllables, her mind clearly on her mother. He himself was processing what had happened that afternoon. Edward Miller, billionaire mogul, accustomed to meetings that decided the fate of hundreds of jobs and multi-million-dollar contracts, was now driving through the streets of New York, with a 5-year-old girl in the back seat, on his way to meet a woman he didn't even know, but who had somehow already become important. When was the last time he had done something without calculating the return, without thinking about benefits, networking, or opportunities? Decades, perhaps. His life had become an endless sequence of strategic decisions, all aimed at profit, growth, and power. But at that moment, driving toward the hospital, he wasn't thinking about any of that. He was just thinking about making sure that Mother survived to be reunited with her daughter. He didn't know it yet, but that decision to stop, to intervene, to help, was about to change his life in a way no multi-million-dollar deal ever could. When they arrived at the hospital, they were met by an efficient medical team that had already been alerted by Robert. Camilla, Isabella's mother, had been taken straight to an emergency room. The doctors worked quickly, hooking up an IV, checking vital signs, running tests. Edward held Isabella's hand as they waited in the quiet, air-conditioned hallway of the private hospital, so different from the reality of overcrowded public hospitals. The girl looked in every direction, clearly frightened by the strange environment. "Mr." she called out, and Edward realized she had started calling him that naturally. "Is my mommy going to be okay?" He squeezed her little hand affectionately. "The doctors here are very good, Isabella. They're going to take great care of your mum." An hour later, a doctor came out of the emergency room and approached them. "Mr. Miller?" she asked, and Edward nodded. "The patient is stable. It was a severe hypertensive crisis combined with dehydration and extreme exhaustion. A few more hours in that state, and it could have been very serious. She was lucky to get here in time." Edward felt a profound sense of relief. "Can she have visitors?" "Yes, but keep it brief. She needs to rest." Isabella practically ran into the room when the doctor opened the door. Camilla was lying in the hospital bed, still very pale, connected to an IV. But her eyes opened when she saw her daughter. "Isa," she whispered, her voice weak, and the little girl carefully climbed onto the bed, snuggling into her mother's arms. Edward stood at the doorway, watching the moment. Camilla looked up and saw him there. Even in her weakened state, she realized that this elegant, clearly wealthy man was the one who had saved her life and taken care of her daughter. "Thank you," she managed to say, her eyes welling up. "Thank you for taking care of her." Edward entered the room, approaching the bed. The way he took in the details, the simple but clean hospital room, the characteristic smell of disinfectant, the constant beeping of the heart monitors. It was all so different from his usual life of offices with panoramic views and meetings in climate-controlled boardrooms. But there was something profoundly human in this environment, something his corporate world had lost long ago. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Your daughter is a very brave little girl. She's the one who found me. And in just a few hours she taught me more about courage and love than I've learned in 50 years. Camilla held Isabella tighter, silent tears streaming down her face. She studied the elegant man's face, trying to understand why someone like him would care about someone like her. There was kindness in his eyes, yes, but also an old sadness, an emptiness that even in her weakened state she could perceive. It was as if he were just as lonely as she was, only in a different way. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice weak but full of worry. "I don't have money to pay for this hospital. Don't worry about that right now," Edward interrupted gently. "Focus on getting better. We'll figure out the rest later." Camilla wanted to protest, her dignity demanding she not accept charity, but her exhausted body and tired mind finally gave in. She closed her eyes, still holding Isabella, and for the first time in months, she felt something she had forgotten: hope. She didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of a story that would test her strength in ways she never imagined, but would also bring her a happiness she thought impossible. And Edward, looking at the mother and daughter embracing in that hospital bed, also didn't know that he had just found something his money could never buy, something that would forever change the course of his lonely, empty life. He had built an empire, conquered markets, defeated fierce competitors. But he was about to discover that the greatest achievement of his life wouldn't come from a boardroom, but from a small house in Astoria, Queens, where two extraordinary women would teach him the true meaning of wealth. There, in that quiet hospital room, 3 lives intertwined in a way that was yet to be revealed, chapter by chapter, in a story of struggle, love, and redemption. Camilla spent 3 days at Mount Sinai Hospital, enough time for the doctors to stabilize her blood pressure, treat the severe dehydration, and investigate the causes of the sudden crisis. It was 3 days of tests, IV drips, forced rest, and a lot of reflection. Lying in that comfortable hospital bed, so different from the old couch in her house, Camilla had too much time to think. She thought about how she had reached this point, about all the warning signs she had ignored because she simply couldn't afford to stop. She thought about her daughter selling mints alone in traffic while she was passed out at home. Guilt gnawed at her, but the doctors and nurses always reminded her. It wasn't her fault she was sick. It was her fault for fighting alone for too long. Throughout this period, Edward Miller was a constant visitor, showing up every morning and afternoon with Isabella, who refused to be away from her mother. The girl would bring drawings she made in the waiting room, tell stories about the birds she saw from the hospital window, and share pieces of cake a kind nurse gave her. And Edward always brought something, a magazine for Camilla to read, fresh fruit, or just his quiet, comforting presence. It was during these visits that Edward began to truly know Camilla. At 32, she had a simple, tired beauty of someone who had worked double shifts her whole life. Her brown eyes held a quiet strength, and even weakened in the hospital bed, she possessed a dignity that deeply impressed Edward. In their conversations, Camilla slowly shared her story with a sincerity he rarely encountered in his social circle. She had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of humble farmers. She came to New York City at 18 looking for opportunities, working every job she could find, from cashier to waitress, until she managed to establish herself as a housekeeper. She married young to a man who promised her the world but abandoned her 6 months pregnant, leaving only debts and disillusionment. "I've raised Isabella on my own ever since," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I worked in 3, sometimes 4 houses a day. I'd get up before dawn, take a crowded city bus, clean the homes of rich people, who barely looked at me, and get back late at night. But I had my daughter, my little rented place, my dignity. I thought I had everything under control." "Until when?" Edward asked, sensing there was more to the story. Camilla took a deep breath. "Until 3 months ago, when I got the news that changed everything." That's when the truth began to emerge. Camilla had a distant aunt, Aunt Connie, whom she barely knew. The woman lived alone in a town in upstate New York and had some assets. A simple but well-located house, a plot of land in a rural area, and some money saved in the bank, the fruit of years of saving. With no children and no close relatives, Aunt Connie had left everything to Camilla in her will. "When the lawyer called, I couldn't believe it," Camilla said. "It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than I'd ever had in my life. A paid-off house, land that could be sold, about $200,000 in savings. For the first time, I thought I could give Isabella a better life. Maybe even stop working so much, put her in a private school." But Camilla's dreams quickly turned into a nightmare. Relatives she didn't even know existed began to appear. First was Robert, the brother-in-law of a distant cousin, a man in his 40s with a prominent belly and a calculating gaze. He introduced himself as practically family, offering to help smooth over the probate process. Then came Sylvia, a second cousin, a woman in her mid-30s, always wearing too much makeup, with fake nails and a syrupy voice that poorly concealed her ambition. She also showed up with offers of help, suggestions on how Camilla should manage the inheritance, and unsolicited advice about quick sales and investments. "They started pressuring me," Camilla continued, and Edward noticed her hands were shaking. "They said I didn't know how to handle money, that I'd get ripped off, that I needed to sell everything quickly before it lost value. Robert brought papers for me to sign, contracts to sell the land for a ridiculous price. Sylvia suggested I transfer the house to her name to avoid taxes," she said. "When I refused, they changed tactics. They said I was ungrateful, that they were just trying to help, that I would regret it." Edward felt anger rising within him. He recognized the pattern immediately. Decades of dealing with the business world had taught him to spot scammers, opportunists, people who smelled vulnerability like sharks smell blood in the water. "The pressure kept mounting," Camilla went on, her voice growing quieter. "They started showing up at my house unannounced, sometimes in the middle of the night, banging on the door, waking Isabella up. Phone calls at all hours, texts saying I was ruining everything, that my creditors would take it all if I didn't act fast. They invented debts that didn't exist, talked about imaginary lawsuits, created false emergencies. Started losing sleep, having anxiety attacks. That's when my blood pressure started to get out of control." Edward was furious but kept his voice calm. "Did you sign any papers?" "No," Camilla answered firmly. "Even though I was scared, even without understanding laws and documents, something inside me told me it was wrong. I just wanted them to leave me alone. But they wouldn't give up." That night, Edward returned to his penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side, but could barely sleep. His mind replayed everything he had discovered. He, who had legal advisors, accountants, and estate specialists at his disposal, knew exactly what to do. But Camilla, alone, without resources or technical knowledge, was completely vulnerable. The next morning, Edward called Francis Reed, one of New York's most renowned estate lawyers. They had worked together years ago on a complex corporate inheritance case, and he trusted her competence and ethics completely. "Francis, I need your help urgently," he said in his opening sentence. "And it's not for me. It's for someone who really needs it." 2 hours later, Francis was at the hospital, an elegant woman in her mid-40s, wearing an impeccable suit and carrying a leather briefcase, full of documents. Edward introduced her to Camilla, who was visibly intimidated. "Camilla," Francis began, sitting beside the bed naturally, "Edward told me about your situation. I know you don't know me and might be wondering why an expensive lawyer is here. The truth is simple. Edward asked for my help, and when I looked at your case, I saw that you are the victim of a clear attempt at family fraud, and I don't tolerate that kind of thing." Camilla looked at Edward, confused. "But I can't afford your services, ma'am. You're not paying," Edward interrupted gently. "Consider it a favor from someone who simply wants to help." In the following days, while Camilla recovered, Francis worked tirelessly. She requested all the probate documents, analyzed every paper Robert and Sylvia had presented to Camilla, and investigated their backgrounds, connections, and true interests. What she discovered was even worse than Edward had imagined. Robert had a history of fraud lawsuits, 2 convictions for document forgery, and was involved in at least 3 land-grabbing schemes upstate. Sylvia also had a record: scams against the elderly, forging power of attorney documents, and involvement in rings specializing in inheritance fraud. They're professionals. Francis explained to Edward and Camilla in a meeting at the hospital, her voice filled with controlled indignation. They monitor obituaries and probate filings, identify vulnerable heirs, and act quickly before the victim has time to seek help. They have a well-established MO. First, they gain trust by presenting themselves as concerned family. Then they create false emergencies to pressure quick decisions, and finally, they coerce the victim into signing documents that transfer assets at ridiculous prices or directly to them. She opened her briefcase and showed them printed documents. "Look what I found. Robert has pulled this scam on at least 4 people in the last 5 years. 2 elderly women in Newark, a widower in Stamford, and a woman in a situation similar to yours in Yonkers. In every case, he approached them claiming distant kinship, offered help, and ended up with part or all of the inheritance. The victims, vulnerable and without legal knowledge, signed without understanding." Camilla brought her trembling hands to her face. "Oh my God, I was almost next. I really almost signed those papers." "But you didn't," Edward said firmly, covering her hands with his, a gesture that had become increasingly natural between them. "Your intuition saved you. It shows how strong you are even when you think you're not." Francis continued, pointing to other documents. "And Sylvia? She has an even longer record. Scams against vulnerable seniors, forging power of attorney documents, involvement in at least 2 rings specializing in inheritance fraud. She's even more dangerous than Robert because she's better at emotional manipulation. Several victims reported that she would cry, hug them, and play the part of a loving cousin while stealing everything behind their backs." Camilla put her hands to her face, shaking. "My God, I almost signed. The day I got sick. Robert had been there early that morning with new papers saying it was urgent, that if I didn't sign by the end of the day, I'd lose the entire inheritance to taxes. I was so confused, so tired. I almost took the pen." "But you didn't," Edward said firmly, holding her hand. "Your intuition saved you." Francis then presented a plan of action. First, she would officially enter the probate case as Camilla's attorney, shielding the assets from any unauthorized access. Second, she would request restraining orders to prevent Robert and Sylvia from approaching Camilla or her home. Third, she would file criminal complaints against both for attempted fraud and coercion. "They will retaliate," Francis warned. "People like them don't give up easily when they lose their prey. Be prepared." And Francis was right. A week later, when Camilla was discharged from the hospital and returned to her home in Astoria, the reaction was swift and furious. Edward, who had insisted on accompanying her home, hired a discreet security guard to be posted on the street. It was a wise decision. On the 3rd day after Camilla's return, Robert and Sylvia showed up, this time accompanied by 2 other people, a large, intimidating man and an older woman who introduced herself as a family witness. But when they tried to bang on the door, they were intercepted by the security guard and a court order that Francis had prepared, a restraining order. Any approach within 300 feet of Camilla or Isabella would result in immediate arrest. The scene was tense. Robert shouted threats. Sylvia cried fake tears, claiming Camilla was being manipulated by a rich man, that he just wanted to take advantage of her, that they were stealing what was rightfully the family's. Neighbors came out to see what was happening. It was Isabella who from the window held Edward's hand and said, "Uncle Edward, you won't let them take Mommy, will you?" Edward knelt to the girl's level. "Never, little one. I promise." And it was a promise he intended to keep, because in the last few weeks, something fundamental had changed within him. The cold, calculating businessman who spent entire days in meetings discussing millions, who dined alone in expensive restaurants, who returned to an empty, impeccable apartment, had discovered something money couldn't buy. He had discovered what it felt like to be truly needed. What it was like to make a difference in someone's life, not with a signature on a contract, but through genuine human connection. Every time Isabella called him Uncle Edward, every time Camilla looked at him with that sincere gratitude in her eyes, every time he saw them laughing together, free from the fear that had haunted them, Edward felt his hardened heart soften just a little. But fate still had trials in store. Because while Edward became more and more involved with Camilla and Isabella, another danger was silently brewing in his own territory, the corporate world. Greg Fisher, a minority partner in Edward's construction firm, had been observing the CEO's changed behavior with growing interest. Edward was missing meetings, delegating decisions, spending hours away from the office. And Greg, ambitious and unscrupulous, saw a golden opportunity. In secret meetings with other board members, Greg began to plant seeds of doubt. "Edward isn't the same man. He's involved with some housekeeper and her daughter, spending company time and money on charity. He's losing focus, making emotional decisions. The company needs firm leadership, not a CEO who's turned into a social worker." The board members, businessmen as cold as Greg, began to have questions. Meetings were scheduled without Edward's knowledge. Documents were moved in secret. A plan began to form. Oust Edward, citing emotional instability, take control of the company, and profit from drastic changes in management. Edward, busy protecting Camilla and Isabella, didn't yet see the conspiracy forming behind his back. But soon, very soon, he would have to fight on two fronts, to save the family he had chosen to protect and to save the company he had built over decades of work. And amidst it all, another feeling was growing silently but powerfully between him and Camilla. It was no longer just gratitude or compassion. It was something deeper, more frightening, more real. Every conversation, every look, every shared moment built a bridge between two worlds that should never have met, but now seemed destined to merge. Isabella, with the innocent wisdom of children, had already noticed. One afternoon, while drawing on the living room floor, she looked up and said, "Mommy, Uncle Edward likes you. I see the way he looks at you when you're not looking." Camilla felt her face flush. "Isa, don't be silly." "It's not silly," the girl insisted, serious. "And you like him too. I know because you smile differently when he comes over." Camilla didn't answer, but she knew her daughter was right, and that truth scared her more than all the greedy relatives combined, because the gap between her world and Edward's seemed insurmountable. What would a rich, successful man, owner of one of the biggest companies in the city, truly want with a housekeeper and her daughter? Fear and hope waged a constant battle in her heart. Edward, in the silence of his lonely nights in his luxury apartment, faced the same questions. He was falling in love. After years of avoiding commitment, focused only on business and profits, he was falling for a woman who didn't know expensive wines, who had never flown first class, who worked with her hands and raised her daughter alone. But maybe that was exactly what drew him to her. The authenticity, the strength, the quiet dignity of someone who fights every day just to survive and still doesn't lose her humanity. Camilla didn't flatter him, didn't feign interest in his multi-million-dollar deals, didn't wear designer clothes to impress him. She was simply herself, a hard-working mother who now had a chance to rebuild her life. Edward had spent decades surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Partners wanted bigger profits. Employees wanted promotions. The women who courted him at social events wanted the status of being with a successful tycoon. But Camilla, she just wanted him to keep being the kind person who defended her daughter in a wine boutique. There were nights when Edward would stand on his apartment balcony, looking at the illuminated city below, and catch himself smiling as he remembered something funny Isabella had said, or the way Camilla furrowed her brow when she was deep in thought. They were simple, everyday memories, but they were worth more than all the million-dollar deals he had ever closed. The next chapters of this story were yet to be written, but one thing was already clear. There was no going back. Edward had chosen his side, and now he would have to face all the consequences of that choice, no matter how painful they might be. Because sometimes the greatest courage isn't winning battles, but admitting your heart has changed direction. 2 months had passed since Edward entered Camilla and Isabella's lives, months that completely transformed the routine of all three. The simple house in Astoria now had discreet security. The fridge was always full, and Isabella was finally attending a quality private school where she made friends and discovered a love for drawing. Camilla, her health restored and her inheritance finally secure thanks to Francis's impeccable work, began to dream again. The house and land upstate were being properly appraised, without pressure, without scams. The money in the bank was earning modest but safe interest. For the first time in years she could breathe, but the peace was fragile and they all knew it. Edward divided his time between his office and the small house in Astoria. His presence became so constant that Isabella started leaving a pair of slippers by the door for him, and Camilla always made fresh coffee when she knew he was coming. They were small domestic gestures that, for a man accustomed to the solitude of an impeccable and empty apartment, were worth more than all the million-dollar deals he had ever closed. It was on a Thursday evening, during a simple dinner of steak with onions and potatoes that Camilla had prepared, that Edward realized an undeniable truth. He was home, not in the penthouse on the Upper East Side, with its city views and designer furniture, but here, at this Formica table, with Isabella excitedly talking about a drawing she made at school, with Camilla smiling as she served the food, with the old fan whirring in the corner of the room. This was home, and he didn't want to be anywhere else. But while Edward's heart found peace, his company was entering a silent war. Greg Fisher had advanced his plan with the precision of a predator. He had convinced 4 of the 7 board members that Edward was emotionally compromised, making impulsive decisions and neglecting the company. Look at the numbers, Greg argued in their secret meetings. He cancelled the Sunbelt expansion, a project that would have netted $50 million in profit, because he wanted to review the workers' labor conditions. He raised the base salaries without consulting the board. He's donating company money to social projects in low-income neighborhoods. This isn't the Edward we knew. The man is having a midlife crisis and the company can't afford to pay for it. Greg's campaign was subtle but effective. He planted doubts, distorted facts, presented numbers, out of context. And worst of all, there was a seed of truth in his words. Edward really had changed. His priorities were no longer exclusively profit and aggressive expansion. He had started to question the human cost of certain decisions, to see the construction workers not as numbers on a spreadsheet, but as fathers and mothers supporting families. He had paused projects to ensure decent working conditions. He had invested in training instead of mass layoffs. To Edward, these were necessary and ethical changes. To Greg and his allies, it was weakness. The bomb dropped on a Monday morning. Edward arrived at his office to find an emergency board meeting had been called for that very afternoon. The agenda: an evaluation of the president's management capabilities. He knew immediately what it was about. Years of corporate politics had taught him to recognize a coup when he saw one. That afternoon, the boardroom on the 42nd floor was tense. The 7 board members sat around the mahogany table, with Greg at the opposite end from Edward, a faint smirk on his lips. What Greg didn't expect was that Edward hadn't come unprepared. He had spent the last week ever since. He'd gotten the first hints of the conspiracy. gathering evidence, preparing arguments, and consulting his own allies. "Gentlemen," Greg began, his voice calculatedly concerned, "I've called this meeting because we have a delicate situation. Our president, a man I have always respected, seems to be going through a difficult personal time that is affecting his professional judgment." Edward didn't move, just watched with cold eyes as Greg presented his case. Cancelled projects, questionable investments in social responsibility, frequent absences, shifting priorities without prior consultation. "I propose," Greg concluded, "a temporary leave of absence from the presidency so that Edward can resolve his personal matters while I assume interim management of the company." The ensuing silence was heavy. 2 board members seemed genuinely concerned for Edward. 4 looked at Greg with poorly disguised approval. 1 remained neutral, studying the situation. It was then that Edward stood up slowly and began to speak. His voice was calm, but it carried an authority that had dominated boardrooms for decades. "Greg has raised valid concerns about changes in the company's management. He's right, I have changed. But not because I'm weak or compromised. I've changed because I've finally started to see beyond the spreadsheets and see human beings." He turned on the projector and began to present numbers, real numbers, not the distorted ones Greg had shown. "The Sunbelt expansion was paused because I discovered, through an audit Greg failed to mention, that the project would have relied on exploiting undocumented workers under unsafe conditions. Had we moved forward, we would be facing criminal charges right now. The base salary increase has reduced our employee turnover by 60%, saving us millions in training and recruitment. The social investments have generated a 20% improvement in our public image, resulting in 3 new government contracts that you are seeing in this quarter's results." Edward paused, letting the numbers sink in. Then he continued, now looking directly at Greg. "As for my absences, they were all communicated and justified. What Greg didn't tell you is that during those absences, I continued to work remotely, keeping all critical decisions on schedule. What he also didn't tell you is that he used my supposed time off to hold parallel meetings, with no minutes, no records, trying to build a shadow board to overthrow me." Greg turned pale. Edward then played his final card. "But the most interesting thing, gentlemen, is what I discovered when I investigated why Greg is so eager to take over now. Francis," he nodded to the lawyer who had entered the room silently, "can explain better." Francis opened her briefcase and began distributing documents. "Greg Fisher has, through shell companies, an agreement with JK Development, our main competitor. If he becomes president, he plans to sell 3 of our most profitable subsidiaries to JK for 40% below market value, in exchange for an ownership stake in their company. It's classic corporate treason." Chaos erupted in the room. Board members read the documents. Greg tried to defend himself. Voices overlapped. But Edward had already won. Within 2 hours, Greg was forced to resign, threatened with lawsuits for breach of fiduciary duty. 2 board members who had supported him also resigned, seeing the ship was sinking. Edward left that room stronger than he had entered, but he was exhausted by corporate games, by betrayals, by a world where even allies of decades could stab you in the back for money. That night, he went straight to Camilla's house. When she opened the door and saw the look on his face, she didn't need to ask a thing. She just pulled him inside, poured him a strong coffee, and sat there in silence, offering the only thing he needed, her presence. "Did you win?" she finally asked. "I won," Edward confirmed. "But I don't know how much longer this world is worth it." Camilla took his hand. "Then maybe it's time to rethink what's worth it to you." Those words echoed in Edward's mind over the next few days. He began to delegate more, to trust competent executives, to step back from the day-to-day operations. Not because he was abandoning the company, but because he was reprioritizing his life. And it was precisely at this moment of personal transformation that the next blow came, this time from where they least expected it. Robert and Sylvia, defeated in their inheritance scheme and sued for attempted fraud, should have been neutralized. But greed is a powerful engine, and they found a terrible loophole to attack. Using a sleazy lawyer named Leo Campbell, known for taking dirty cases in exchange for high percentages, they filed for custody of Isabella. The claim was cruel and calculated. Camilla was an emotionally unstable mother with a recent history of hospitalization, living off a legally disputed inheritance, and under the influence of a wealthy man with questionable intentions. The child, they argued, was at risk. When the notice arrived, Camilla felt the floor drop out from under her. She was in the kitchen making Isabella a snack when the process server knocked on the door. As she read the document, her legs gave out, and she had to lean on the table. Losing her daughter. The possibility was more terrifying than any other threat she had ever faced. Isabella was everything. The reason she woke up before dawn to clean houses. The reason she endured humiliation. The reason she kept fighting when everything seemed impossible. Edward arrived half an hour later, summoned in a hurry. He found Camilla sitting on the kitchen floor, the notice crumpled in her hands, silent tears streaming down her face. "They're going to take my daughter from me," she whispered, her voice broken. "They're going to use everything I've been through against me. They'll say I'm not capable, that I don't have the stability that—" "They won't," Edward interrupted, kneeling beside her, holding her face in his hands. "I promise you, they won't. We're going to fight this, Camilla. And we're going to win." But deep down, they both knew this would be the hardest battle yet. Because the legal system, despite its good intentions, sometimes mistakes vulnerability for incompetence. A single mother, without vast resources, with a history of a health crisis, could be seen as too fragile to care for her child, even if that fragility was caused by her struggle to protect her in the first place. When consulted, Francis was direct. "It's a dirty, malicious lawsuit, but technically possible. They'll try to build a narrative of instability. They'll call fabricated witnesses. Maybe even neighbors they might have paid off. We need to build a solid defense, showing not only that Camilla is an exemplary mother, but that Isabella is in a stable and safe environment." It was then that Edward made the decision that would change everything. That night, after Isabella was asleep, he asked to speak with Camilla alone. They sat on the small front porch, the distant noise of the city around them, the New York sky with its few visible stars peeking through the light pollution. "Camilla," Edward began, and she noticed he was nervous, a rare sight, for the always composed man. "Over the past few months, you and Isabella have changed my life in a way I never thought possible. I spent decades building a company, accumulating wealth, achieving success, but every night I came home to an empty apartment and felt hollow. With you, I feel whole." Camilla's heart pounded, but she said nothing, just waited. "I've fallen in love with you," Edward continued, his voice firm despite his nerves. "I fell in love with your strength, your dignity, the way you fight for Isabella every single day. And I fell in love with that little girl who walked into a wine boutique asking for water and changed my life forever." He took her hands, which were trembling. "Marry me, Camilla. Not because of the lawsuit, not to make our defense easier, although that's also true, but because I want to build a family with you. I want to wake up next to you every day. I want to watch Isabella grow up. I want the two of you to be my real family." If you were in Camilla's shoes, would you accept Edward's proposal, or would you be afraid people would think you were a gold digger? Let us know in the comments. Camilla felt the tears fall. Fear and hope waged a fierce battle in her chest. "Edward, are you sure? The world will say I'm a gold digger, that I took advantage of you, that I'm after your money. They'll say I'm an opportunist who threw herself at the first rich man who came along." "Let the world say whatever it wants," Edward replied, with a firmness that left no room for doubt. "I know the truth, and the truth is that for the first time in my life, I'm not making a decision based on business or convenience. I'm making a decision based on love. And if the world doesn't understand that, that's the world's problem, not ours." Camilla looked deep into his eyes and saw pure sincerity. She saw a man who had learned, through a child selling mints in traffic, that the value of life isn't measured in money, but in true human connections. "Yes," she whispered, "I'll marry you." The kiss that followed was gentle, filled with promises, and a future that just months ago neither of them could have ever imagined. The next day, Francis filed a motion. That completely changed the course of the custody case. Camilla and Edward were officially engaged. The child that Robert and Sylvia claimed was at risk was now part of a structured family, with a mother and a father figure, abundant resources, and emotional and financial stability. More than that, Francis brought to light all the evidence of the previous fraud attempts, the ongoing criminal proceedings against Robert and Sylvia, and their dubious histories. She showed that the custody petition had nothing to do with Isabella's well-being, and everything to do with revenge and a desperate attempt to gain access to the inheritance through the child. The hearing was set for 3 weeks later, and as they prepared for the legal battle that would define their family's fate, Edward, Camilla, and Isabella began to truly become a family. Not just on paper, but in their hearts, in the small routines, the dinners at the table, the bedtime stories, the shared dreams. Edward started spending more time at the house in Astoria than at his penthouse. He, who had always lunched at expensive restaurants or in his executive office, now delighted in the simple dishes Camilla prepared: spaghetti and meatballs, a well-seasoned steak, a fresh salad. There was something deeply comforting in those homemade flavors at that Formica table, in those unscripted conversations. Isabella flourished in this new family environment. She, who once carried the weight of helping her mother on her small shoulders, could now simply be a child. She laughed more, played more, dreamed more. Sometimes Edward would catch her dancing alone in the living room or humming while she drew, and his heart would fill with a joy he had never known. Camilla, in turn, was rediscovering who she was beyond being a single mother struggling for survival. With her health restored, her inheritance protected, and someone to share responsibilities with, she began to have time for herself. She started reading again, a pleasure she had abandoned due to lack of time and energy. She discovered she enjoyed cooking not out of necessity, but for pleasure, trying new recipes on the weekends. Isabella, with the simple wisdom of children, summed it all up one afternoon while drawing on the living room floor. She looked up at Edward and Camilla, holding hands on the couch, and said with a huge smile, "Now we're a real family, right? It's not just me and Mommy anymore. You're here too, Dad." It was the first time she had called him Dad, and Edward, the man who controlled millions, who commanded hundreds of employees, who negotiated with governors and mayors without flinching, felt his eyes well up. "Yes, little one," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Now we're a real family." And that child, who months ago was selling mints barefoot in traffic while her mother lay unconscious at home, now had a father, a safe home, and a possible future. But the story wasn't over yet. The final battle was still to come, and it would be in a courtroom that everyone's fate would be decided once and for all. The day of the hearing dawned grey over New York City, with those heavy clouds that threaten rain but never quite commit. Camilla had barely slept, tossing and turning, imagining every possible scenario. Edward stayed by her side all night, holding her hand, reminding her that she was no longer alone in this fight. Isabella, who despite being only 5 understood that something important was happening, hugged her mother at breakfast and said, "Mommy, don't be sad, nobody's going to take me away from you. I won't let them." The innocence and certainty in the little girl's voice almost broke Camilla, but she held herself together. She had to be strong. At 9 in the morning, they arrived at the New York County Supreme Court. The imposing building with its columns and grand staircases was intimidating. Francis was waiting for them at the entrance, elegant as always, leather briefcase in hand, and an expression of controlled confidence. "Everything's ready," she told Edward and Camilla. "I have all the documents, all the witnesses, all the evidence. Robert and Sylvia dug their own graves with this lawsuit. Now we just have to show that to the judge." In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. On one side, Edward, Camilla, and Francis. On the other, Robert and Sylvia, accompanied by their lawyer Leo Campbell, a man in a cheap suit and a flashy tie, known in the courthouse corridors for taking lost causes in exchange for upfront payments. The judge, Judge Henry Monroe, a man in his 60s with grey hair and the weary eyes of someone who had seen it all in decades on the bench, entered, and everyone rose. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and opened the case file. Case number 2345, docket 2025, he read in a monotone voice. Petition for custody of the minor, Isabella Santos, currently in the maternal custody of Camila Santos. Petitioners, Robert Mendez and Sylvia Costa, claiming kinship and concern for the child's welfare. Let the hearing begin. Leo Campbell was the first to speak, rising with dramatic flair. Your Honor, my clients, moved by familial love and genuine concern, come before this court to request custody of their distant niece, who is currently in a vulnerable situation. The mother, Camila Santos, has a history of recent hospitalization for mental health issues. Francis stood up immediately. Objection, Your Honor, for the record. Ms. Santos was hospitalized for a hypertensive crisis and exhaustion, not for psychiatric issues. That is a gross misrepresentation of the facts. The judge waved for her to sit. Noted. Continue, Mr. Campbell. Furthermore, Leo went on, the mother is under the influence of a wealthy man, Mr. Edward Miller, who appeared out of nowhere in their lives and quickly established a relationship of dependency. There are clear signs of manipulation, of taking advantage of a vulnerable woman, of financial interest in a recent inheritance. The child is being exposed to an unstable and morally questionable environment. Camilla felt Edward's hand squeeze hers under the table. She took a deep breath, trying to control the rage and pain of those accusations. Then it was Francis's turn. She rose with the calm of someone who knows they hold all the winning cards. Your Honor, what we have just heard is a narrative built on lies, distortions, and bad faith litigation. I will now demonstrate point by point the truth of the matter. She opened her briefcase and began distributing documents. First, Ms. Camilla's hospitalization. Here are the complete medical records. She suffered a severe hypertensive crisis caused by extreme stress. And do you know the source of that stress? The very petitioners in this case, Robert Mendez and Sylvia Costa, who for months harassed, threatened, and tried to coerce Ms. Santos into signing fraudulent documents to steal her inheritance. She paused, letting the information sink in, then continued. Here is the proof. Recordings of threatening messages, witness statements from neighbors about them trespassing on Ms. Santos's property, copies of police reports. Even more serious, there are ongoing criminal proceedings against both for attempted fraud and coercion. Robert Mendez has 2 prior convictions for document forgery. Sylvia Costa is under investigation for her involvement in a ring that specializes in scamming vulnerable heirs. Robert and Sylvia began to shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Leo Campbell tried to object, but Francis gave him no room. As for the alleged manipulation by Mr. Edward Miller, he met Ms. Santos when her daughter Isabella, at just 5 years old, was selling mints in traffic under a scorching sun because her mother was at home, sick and without resources, being preyed upon by the petitioners. Mr. Miller acted as any decent human being would. He offered help. He paid for the hospital, hired lawyers to protect the family from scammers, and yes, he fell in love with Miss Santos's courage and dignity. Francis then played her final card. Your Honor, this custody petition has nothing to do with the child's welfare. It is a desperate and vengeful attempt by people who were stopped from stealing an inheritance and now want to use a child as a tool for blackmail. The minor, Isabella, whom the petitioners claim to be concerned about, was found by witnesses selling mints in traffic at 5 years old. And where were Robert and Sylvia at that moment, not helping but pressuring her sick mother to sign fraudulent papers? The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the judge, accustomed to all sorts of cases, seemed struck by the turn of events. I have here, Francis continued, psychological evaluations of the minor, Isabella, conducted by 3 independent professionals. All of them attest that she is a healthy, happy, well-cared-for child who is extremely attached to her mother. I also have a social worker's assessment of the family's current residence, showing a suitable, safe, and structured environment. And I have statements from teachers at the private school Isabella now attends, all praising her development, her joy, and the constant presence of her parents at school activities. She paused, looking directly at Robert and Sylvia. This case is a sham, Your Honor, and I ask not only that it be dismissed, but that action be taken against the petitioners for bad faith litigation and malicious use of the judicial system. Judge Henry Monroe took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a habit he had when he needed to process complex information. Then he looked at Leo Campbell. "Mr. Campbell, do your clients wish to respond?" Leo, visibly shaken by the revelations, stammered, "Your Honor, my clients, we were not fully aware of—" "Not aware?" The judge cut him off, his voice now harsh. "Counselor, it is your duty to be aware of the facts before filing a lawsuit, especially one involving a child. This court is not a stage for personal vendettas or extortion attempts." He then turned to Robert and Sylvia. "Petitioners, please rise." Both stood, clearly nervous. "You came to this court claiming concern for a child who, according to the documents presented, you completely ignored her entire life, except when you saw an opportunity for financial gain through her mother. You caused this mother's illness with your pressure and threats, and now you have the audacity to claim she is unfit to care for her daughter. This is not just bad faith litigation, it is cruelty." The judge picked up his gavel. "Custody petition denied. Furthermore, I am ordering a formal investigation into the petitioners and their counsel for malicious prosecution. I am also issuing a permanent protective order. Robert Mendez and Sylvia Costa are prohibited from approaching Camila Santos and her daughter Isabella within 1,500 feet, under penalty of immediate arrest. The DA's office will be notified of the crimes mentioned by the defense. This hearing is adjourned." The bang of the gavel echoed through the room like a liberating thunderclap. Camilla broke down in tears, this time of pure relief. Edward hugged her, feeling his own chest tighten with emotion. Isabella, who had been waiting in a separate room with a social worker, was brought back in and ran into her mother's arms. "Did we win, Mummy?" she asked, her big eyes hopeful. "We won, my love," Camilla answered between tears and laughter. "We won." On the other side of the room, Robert and Sylvia were being escorted out, Leo Campbell trying to distance himself from the case as quickly as possible. The greed that had driven them was now turning into fear of the legal consequences they would face. In the months that followed, the family's life was completely transformed. Edward and Camilla were married in a simple ceremony with only close friends and, of course, Isabella as the flower girl, proud in her little white dress. They moved into a larger but not ostentatious house. Edward had learned that luxury wasn't measured in square footage or designer furniture, but in laughter around the dinner table, in bedtime hugs, in shared stories. Camilla, with her inheritance finally secure and wisely managed by Francis, fulfilled her dream. She created a non-profit to support working single mothers. She called it the Isabella Project, in honor of the daughter who had taught her the true meaning of courage. The project offered free legal aid to housekeepers and domestic workers, helping them understand their rights, negotiate better conditions, and protect themselves from exploitation. Within 6 months, it had already helped over 200 women. Edward, transformed by everything he had experienced, completely changed the management of his company. He created training programs for employees' children, invested in daycares and schools in underserved communities, and established strict standards for working conditions on all his construction sites. His profits dipped slightly, but his peace of mind soared. "You know," he told Camilla one evening as they watched Isabella play in the yard, "I spent 50 years accumulating money and power, thinking that was success. But I only discovered what it really means to win when a 5-year-old girl asked for a glass of water, and I decided not to turn away." Camilla snuggled into his arms. "She saved you just as much as you saved us." "She saved all of us," Edward corrected. Isabella, now 6, attended an excellent school and excelled at drawing. Her teachers said she had a special talent for art, an ability to express deep emotions through colors and shapes. When asked where this sensitivity came from, she would simply say, "I learned it when I was selling mints in traffic. I learned to really see people." On a sunny Saturday, almost a year after that fateful day at the wine boutique, Edward, Camilla and Isabella returned to where it all began. The boutique was still there, still elegant, still air-conditioned, still serving expensive wines. But Mark, the arrogant employee, was gone. He had been fired weeks after the incident, replaced by a staff trained to treat every customer with equal respect, regardless of their appearance or background. Edward bought a bottle of wine, not the most expensive one, but one he liked. As they left, he saw a child on the street, a boy of about 7 selling gum. Without hesitation, he called the boy over, bought all the gum he had, and asked about his story. 2 weeks later, that boy and his mother were also receiving help from the Isabella Project. It wasn't charity, it was humanity. It was the chain of good that Isabella had started without knowing, simply by having the courage to ask for a glass of water. The years passed. Isabella grew up, becoming a brilliant teenager and then a talented young adult. She graduated with a degree in social work, a choice that surprised no one. Her senior thesis was on the impact of support networks in breaking cycles of poverty, inspired by her own story. At her graduation, when she walked onto the stage to receive her diploma, Isabella looked out at the audience and saw her parents, Edward and Camilla, holding hands, their eyes misty with pride. In that moment, she remembered that unbearably hot afternoon, when she was just 5 years old, barefoot in traffic selling mints to help her sick mother. She remembered the employee who humiliated her, the businessman who defended her, the hospital where she was reunited with her mother, the battles they fought together. And she realized her story wasn't about being saved. It was about the transformative power of a single choice. The choice to see another person, to extend a hand, to not turn away. That night, at the graduation party, Edward made a toast. To Isabella, who at 5 years old with a baggie of mints in her hand, taught me more about life, love and purpose than 50 years in business ever could. May your generation be better than mine. May you look more at people and less at profits, and may you understand that true wealth is measured in lives transformed, not in digits in a bank account. Camilla, now a mature, confident, and fulfilled woman, added, "And may we never forget that sometimes all a person needs is a glass of water, offered with dignity, not arrogance. Small gestures can change entire destinies." Isabella hugged her parents, the kind of tight embrace that only real families know how to give. And there, in that moment of celebration, 3 lives improbably brought together by fate celebrated not just a graduation, but a journey of transformation that began on the hottest afternoon of summer, amidst honking horns and melting asphalt, with a barefoot little girl who had the courage to ask for help. Because, in the end, this wasn't a story about a millionaire who saved a poor child. It was a story about how a brave child saved a man who had everything but purpose. It was about how a fighting mother taught a tycoon the true meaning of wealth. It was about how love can be born in the most unlikely of places and blossom in ways that transform not just individual lives, but the fabric of the society around them. And as New York City continued its frantic routine outside, with its traffic, its heat, its inequalities, inside that party was living proof that change is possible, that humanity still exists, that a single act of kindness can trigger a cascade of transformations that echo through generations. Robert and Sylvia, those who tried to destroy everything for greed, ended up serving time for fraud and were forgotten by their family. Greg Fisher, the treacherous partner, lost everything he had built and languished in the failure of his own schemes. The villains of the story received their justice, not through revenge, but as the natural consequence of their own choices. And the wine boutique where it all began. It became part of an emotional walking tour that Isabella created years later. Places in New York where real stories of transformation happened. She would take groups of social work students to these spots, tell the stories, and inspire new generations to see beyond appearances, to act beyond indifference. That graduation night, after everyone had gone home and the family returned to their house, Isabella took out her old diary, the one her mother had given her years ago. She flipped through the pages until she found the first drawing she had made after her mother's hospitalization. A small girl, a man in a suit and a mommy in a hospital bed, all holding hands. Underneath the drawing, in the shaky handwriting of a 5-year-old learning to write, she had written, "The day I got a dad and mommy got better forever." And she did. Camilla never had another blood pressure crisis. Edward never felt empty again. Isabella never had to sell mints in traffic again. But none of them ever forgot where they came from, the battles they fought, the tears they shed, and the strength they discovered when they decided, together, that they deserved more. Because sometimes in the midst of unbearable heat, chaotic traffic, and widespread indifference, all a life needs to completely change is for someone to stop, to truly look, and to say, "You are not alone, I see you, and I will help." And that is exactly what Edward did that afternoon in the wine boutique. And that is exactly what transformed 3 lives forever. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Camilla, Edward, and Isabella has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of struggle, love, and transformation, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment struck you the most. Was it when Edward defended Isabella in the boutique? When Camilla found the strength to fight for her daughter? Or when the family won together at the hearing? Every day, we bring you intense stories like this. Stories that reveal the deepest side of the human soul. Stories that remind us that small gestures can change entire destinies. We'll see you in the next episode, with another narrative that will move, inspire, and make you believe that kindness still exists in the world.